Here we are at the end and climax, the last act of this exciting first day of our conference, and I'm very, very honored to introduce you to Naomi André, who will deliver the keynote address. So Naomi André grew up in a musical family. Your mother was a soprano. That's right, and coloratura soprano. So that started her career and love for opera, for music, and in fact, after her PhD at Harvard, she started teaching at the University of Michigan, but her first book in 2006 was a book about castrati, travestiti, and the seconda donna in Italian early 19th century music called Voicing Gender. I'm sure. I mean, it was an important book. After that, Naomi André took a different turn and started looking at race and blackness as important and under-considered aspects of opera, and that led to the editing of two important volumes, Blackness in Opera and the African Performance Arts. But the real revolution, the real earthquake in opera studies was Black opera history, power, engagement in 2018. That really was like a major event in the history of musicology. And in fact, the year later, Naomi André was invited as the inaugural scholar in residence for Seattle Opera, which shows that for once, opera companies didn't use IA, but realized that it was important to consult with scholars who were active in addressing for the first time the problems of representations of blackness in opera, but also the virtual absence of operas composed by African American composers or casting actors that, black actors that in roles that were diversified. And that they started a collaboration with many other opera companies, including Detroit Opera, and the writing of program notes, program essays, not just the little notes, but long essays for the program for Blue, Fire Shut Up in My Bones, and Naomi was also the founding member of Black Opera Research Network, BORN. Black Opera Research Network. So that's to show, that this is really incredible that we managed to have Naomi André with us today. So please welcome Naomi André.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. And my story is kind of interesting, but and I can certainly talk about it at another time. I've worked with a bunch of opera companies, every major opera company in the United States, and several regional companies. And my work, this is the first opera conference I've ever been invited to, so I'm really thrilled to be here. Okay, I also know that we've been in this room for a while, and I would love to hear practically everyone in this room give a keynote, so I'm offering this as a beginning of a conversation. And thank you so much for the invitation and bringing us all together, Pierpaolo. Okay, it is a real pleasure to have the opportunity to share some of my recent work with you I'm going to divide my talk into 4 contrapuntal episodes that bring together ideas I've been thinking about for a while. And then I had the wonderful opportunity to open up and expand recently, last academic year, on a fellowship at the National Humanities Center in North Carolina. I've also been thinking about these things over the summer and in those precious stolen moments during a busy academic year. Usually I work hard to make the sections of a lecture segue smoothly into each other. This talk is going to be a little different because I want to bring you along with me as I'm thinking through some new ideas and laying a foundation for this new project. So the 4 parts of my talk, ideas about realism in opera, a paradigm I'm putting together, piloting in this talk, harm, care, and repair. I'm going to focus on 3 operas, and my apologies that in my abstract I was hoping to look at Ai Weiwei's work and some by Anadamar, by Golojov, but unfortunately the timing, I'm not able to do that. I'm very happy to talk about that more with you later, and I've got an article that I'm working on for Opera Quarterly in a guest edited collection by Marcus Pyle, so that those operas will be discussed more. Oh my goodness, thank you. Okay, and then moving forward, so. Oops. All right, there we go. Sorry, I'll get that more coordinated. I'm not technologically really together. So part 1, the construction of reality. What is real? What is actually existing and happening is something that the genre of opera has grappled with since its beginnings in the 17th century. To the casual observer, it is obvious that the stylized convention of relating stories through singing, costumes, and staging, all accompanied by an orchestra, is the very opposite of what appears to be real. And yet to anyone caught within the magical power of a powerful performance, seasoned opera lover or first-time attendee, there can be something profoundly real emotionally about how we perceive what is happening on stage in the opera house. The history of opera encompasses many discussions of how reality is captured. The story of the Florentine Camerata, groups of humanists, musicians, and intellectuals who gathered in and around Florence in the late 16th century in the salons of the Count Giovanni de' Bardi and Jacopo Corsi. These are known to opera students as the incubators for inventing opera. These early innovators were partly reacting against the dense polyphonic musical textures of the late Renaissance to change the paradigm for the early Baroque, where the text was to be understood and performed by a standalone monophonic voice with simple accompaniment. From the beginning of opera, the emphasis on the words and solo voice stemmed from a desire to recreate the power and emotion of music discussed by the ancient Greeks, such as Plato and Aristotle. These writings were being circulated among humanists and other academics at the end of the 16th century. As far as we know, no musical exemplars from the Greek plays were available to the late Italian Renaissance thinkers. However, a primary goal was to have the affective power of the voice front and center. The history of opera juxtaposes the origin of staged musical spectacle with various discourses around the construction of realness over time. From the basic issues, quote, from the basic issues of verisimilitude raised by the requirement of speaking in song, recitar cantando, to character types, poetic styles, and appropriate topics, a measurement of truth was integral to early opera. The definitions of verisimilitude were capacious as to how ideas of truth, which I'm going to connect to a formation of reality, were constructed. Italian and French 17th century readings of Aristotle's Poetics not only are shaped by national tastes regarding spoken drama and the use of spectacle and machines, but also how history and fable could be intertwined with the use of mythological figures to provide advice and save the day, such as the popular convention of the Deus ex machina. Moving forward from 1570, publication with Lodovico Castelvetro's commentary on Aristotle's Poetics, Piero Weiss outlines the spaciousness in meanings associated with verisimilitude. In addition to national differences, Italian and French, in the styles of opera, there is an early agreement between Italian and French theorists on a bifurcation of how an entwined truth realism could be portrayed. One type of reality is that which is more common and predictable. The other type is less predictable, less frequent, rarer, extraordinary, and marvelous. My point in outlining these two forms of reality is less about how they contrast and more to the fact that the earliest discourses around opera in the first two nations who developed this genre extended the meaning of opera to include two seemingly opposed forces: ordinary and rare, expected and unpredictable, common and extraordinary. From its earliest origins, opera was a genre that synthesized multiple narratives and diverse truths as it portrayed historical subjects to an audience that also witnessed the intervention of mythological and supernatural characteristics. I've been thinking about a model for addressing social injustice in areas where there have been legacies of pain. I'm referring to issues and topics that are connected to things that happened a long time ago and were thought to be acceptable, but in the past few decades, we are seeing some change. We have witnessed a social reckoning where when we talk about what the majority now thinks, some things are shifting. Undergirding such discussions are the movements around Me Too, queer and trans identities, and Black Lives Matter. Concomitantly, there is a climate around lived injustices. I'm referring to how the inequities around the distribution of wealth and the articulation of caste have led to vast differences in the opportunities that people can realistically achieve. By caste, I'm building off Isabel Wilkerson's construction in her 2020 influential book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, that thoughtfully interweaves how race, class, and respectability are wrapped together in the United States. Yet I augur that through legacies of colonialism in Europe, as well as chattel slavery and settler colonialism against Native Americans in the United States, there are inequitable differences in our lived experiences that taint our shared collective unity in the United States. And to further complicate the scene, I'm also talking about harm and the real terror to those of us in the United States who are living with gun violence. I speak as a Black woman who, as a graduate student in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at Harvard during the early 1990s, I frequently heard about young Black undergraduates, particularly men, getting stopped by the police for no reason when they were walking around the Back Bay or shopping in Copley Place, two affluent areas in Boston. As a resident tutor at Winthrop House, one of the undergraduate houses, my graduate training in musicology was complemented by the act of caring and helping students of color survive various microaggressions and little acts of trauma that were woven into their daily lives. I'm also speaking as a new faculty member at the University of North Carolina, where in the beginning of the second week of classes this past fall, Monday, August 28th, around 1 p.m., I was part of a lockdown where there was an active shooter on my new campus. For several hours in my office building, I sheltered in place, staying away from the windows, blockading the door, staying still and quiet. I saw helicopters circulating the area near my office and received many text alerts to stay in place. Later that evening, we learned that a troubled graduate student in applied physics had obtained a gun, gone into his lab, and shot his advisor. We live in a time when current difficulties are both a continuation of a long-held desire for revenge and justice, as well as an inheritance being forged within a crucible lined with legacies of oppression, domination, and the quest for empire. And these things affect our daily lives. They are part of our daily realities. our lived realities. They infuse our values and the aesthetics through which we comprehend our shared present. How do we now understand sexual harassment and consent in the midst of alcohol and recreational barbiturates, or unwelcomed yet helpful gifts and perks? How do we allow an acceptance for other people's desires around sexuality and sexual expression when we ourselves harbor an internal censor that can feel vulnerable around such difference and threatened by our own unreconciled feelings? What are now considered appropriate, accurate, and truthful representations of minority populations that were oppressed in a past that frequently extends into our present? If there is there a place on stage, artistic stages, opera, theater, musical theater, ballet, and film for blackface and yellowface? How do we stage new productions and contend with classic older productions that use previously uncommented upon practices? To name just a few of the most popular works in my research world that center stage these issues: Shakespeare's Othello, Verdi's Aida and Otello, Puccini's Madama Butterfly and Turandot, Bizet's Carmen, and Tchaikovsky's Arabian Coffee and Chinese Tea dances, especially with the evergreen Balanchine choreography in Act 2 of The Nutcracker. How do we represent foreign, indigenous, and other supposedly exotic groups of people? In addition to depictions of non-white communities, how do we handle non-white nationalities and ethnicities to signal their individuality, but not wildly gesticulate their otherness? How thin is the line between homage and tribute, parody and appropriation? When does something go too far? And perhaps more vexing, who gets to decide? In my current project, I'm writing about Blackness in opera from the US from the 19th century to the present, and I realize that my work intersects with these larger issues. I am newly learning through my own research and that of others that Black folks have been a part of the story of opera for a long time, especially in the United States. The exclusion of this knowledge is painful. As a Black singer, more so when I was younger in college, and now as a musicologist who is an opera scholar, I'm rather frustrated and angry that this rich history has been going on and yet has been hidden in the shadows, what I'm calling a Black opera shadow culture. Such a Black opera shadow culture is not lesser than the majority culture. It has been happening simultaneously as the mainstream white opera tradition, just out of sight and too frequently undocumented. The story of American music is incomplete as it has relegated Black people to only certain kinds of music, sorrow songs that have become spirituals, blues, gospel, jazz, soul, funk, Motown, R&B, hip hop. These are fabulous musics, but they are all in the religious, vernacular, and popular music genres. Never have we had a public narrative passed down in textbooks and pedagogy of the continuing rich tradition of Black folks in classical art and concert music, opera, symphony, string quartets, ballets, and you know in this room, I know you know, the list continues. Yet Black folks, including many of those in popular music forms, were also trained and excelled in so many types of music and artistic expressions. Many, not all, but many of the early blues, jazz, gospel, and Motown musicians were exposed to and trained in the European musical tradition of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. They received this training in Black churches, which also served as de facto concert halls during segregation up through the 1960s. They received this in HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. I have colleagues now who are studying the music curricula of HBCUs. In smaller numbers, Black folks have also studied in PWIs, predominantly white institutions, since the late 19th century, where there is a long and yet to be written history of Black musicians who, one at a time, were allowed to study in leading institutions. And the people I know who are working on this have noticed this particularly in Oberlin and the New England Conservatory and the Juilliard School. My main point here is to say that this exclusion in history, not having a record of Black folks in opera and other classical musics, has caused harm. I'm constructing a model of harm, care, and repair for identifying, reckoning with, and changing the obscurity of this history of exclusion. Before I outline my developing model of harm, care, and repair, I want to happily acknowledge that I am not the only person working in this arena. And as I've been researching, there are many related paths that are developing inside and outside of the academy. In musicology, Will Chang's work includes listening, performance, and care. Even recently at the AMS in Denver this past November, Suzanne Cusick embraced Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's work in her presidential lecture, Dreaming Reparative Musicologists in a Paranoid Time. Outside of music, we have many helpful approaches for analyzing and unpacking ways to deal with harm and systemic inequities. Trauma studies around historical and current issues, theories in social justice, such as Robert Livingston's press model, and ideas around restorative and reparative justice are just a few arenas I have found especially useful for my thinking. I'm calling harm the pain that has been caused by others and hurts people. Harm can be inherited and passed down in a legacy such as the aftermaths of slavery that are different across the world. A few examples in the United States from the not distant past are the existence of sundown towns and the redlining of housing districts. These practices were happening in some places through the 1960s, 1970s, and into the 1980s during the time of my childhood and perhaps others in this room. Sometimes harm is intentional, wanting to prove a point, wanting to cause physical pain, wanting to teach someone a lesson in a vengeful way. Sometimes harm is unintentional and happens inadvertently. It is an accidental consequence. The person causing harm did not mean for anyone to get hurt. They did not know that what they did was painful. They might even feel misunderstood because they themselves were reacting from a place of hurt and lashed out without even knowing it. In this model of harm, I am not casting specific people as either or constant perpetrators. Instead, I see harm as something that is part of our lives. Harm is complicated because at some point, everyone does it. Additionally, everyone at some point gets hurt. The people who cause harm are not bad people. They are people who have caused harm. Harm is something that happens and needs to be dealt with. I'm defining care as something we do with sensitivity to respond to harm. Care might be a little like restorative justice, like a restorative, reparative justice system in trying to deal with the harm rather than focusing only on the punitive. An unexpected angle of care is that it involves generosity from both parties. The person who caused harm needs to be generous to realize that what happened, despite possible good intentions, is that they hurt someone, and the perpetrator needs to take some sort of responsibility. This responsibility is in the acknowledgement that their actions harmed someone. The acknowledgement looks like a careful listening and then repeating back what happened and how it caused hurt. The person who caused the harm needs to affirm that they will do their very best not to cause this harm again. The person who was harmed also needs to exhibit generosity. They need to realize that after the perpetrator has listened and acknowledged the harm and has promised to try to do their best not to do it again, they both need to move forward. This is not about forgetting, bless you, or a mandated forgiveness. There are a lot of studies that indicates that at some point forgiveness might come and aid with healing, particularly studies that deal with a religious, moral, philosophical view, and those in health and wellness. Many believe that some sort of forgiveness is very valuable, even necessary for the person who is the survivor. The main point is that generosity provided both by the perpetrator and the victim helps both parties move forward. Moving forward is important for them individually and helpful if they work together in the same environment and are part of the same community. But even if they go their own way and are not in touch, it is important to pave the way for healing and moving forward. I like this word repair since it is linked to reparations, but it does not carry the same financial connotations. I'm not saying that financial reparations are never needed. I'm just not making it a fixture in my model of harm, care, and repair. Repair is the active work that paves the way for healing and recovering from the harm. Repair is the goal that does not focus on the punishment or the reward. Instead, repair looks towards rehabilitation in the sense of restoring and rebuilding. Such restoration does not emphasize the return to a former state. We cannot erase the harm to pretend it never existed. Instead, this model looks towards redeeming and recovering a new state of grace. Ideally, a feeling of redemption leads to the result of using care to repair the harm. Why is this important? What is at stake? Such issues rely upon seeing others as being fully human. We all have emotions and feel pain, joy, and love. Accepting the artistic expressions of art by members from all of humanity shows that we can communicate through aesthetic means. This can allow everyone to experience feelings and have emotions that have been created, composed, and written, and embodied in performance by people who look like us, as well as by folks who do not look like us. I argue that sitting through an opera, experiencing a narrative that includes familiar stories as well as new ones, and being moved emotionally helps us see the full humanity of all of us as people. I'm not proposing that a model of harm, care, repair replace the legal justice system, but to exist adjacently and act as a supplement. For example, we have seen in the US that laws and legislature that allow access and work towards equality and equity do not help those who have deeply internalized white supremacy to accept Black people as full citizens. You cannot legislate the heart to suddenly believe something new. Yet, if you can touch someone through their feelings and emotions, you can help open their heart that can lead to new ideas and thoughts. Okay. This part is where I'm going to walk us through a few operas because Blue, Omar, and The Factotum are still fairly new operas. Blue is the oldest. It premiered in 2019 at Glimmerglass Festival and was co-commissioned by the Glimmerglass Festival and Washington National Opera, where Francesca Zambello was the co-director of both. She's now stepped down from Glimmerglass and but still runs the Washington National Opera. Omar, gosh, how much do I say now? Okay. I want to spend a little time. This is where it's like, okay, let me stick to the text because I don't want us to be here all night, even though I could talk about these for all night. I want to spend a little time exploring a few operas that begin to flesh out these ideas around a new realism in opera and the model of harm, care, and repair. My apologies for the spoiler alerts as I talk about the plots of these operas. I'm going to focus on these three recent works. And to give you a sense of these three new works, many of which you might not yet have had a chance to see, I've assembled a few slides with pictures of each production to quickly walk you through some of the main themes. And I also will start with my connection to each opera and then move through the production pictures. Okay, so Blue, my connection, this is an opera by Janine Tesori as the composer and Tazewell Thompson, who is the librettist, and he came up with the story. Francesca Zambello and Glimmerglass and WNO had a big grant to have a group that, in addition to workshops where people came to Glimmerglass, and I got to see one of the workshops in the summer of 18. It premiered in the summer of 2019. I also was part of a group that included Janine and Tazwell, Kenneth Kellogg, who sang the father, Brianna Hunter, who was the mother, and sometimes there'd be another person from the cast. And we went to different opera companies, talked about, it was called Breaking Glass for Glimmerglass, and talking about diversity and different types of operas. Okay. Has anybody seen this opera here? So just a few. Okay, I'm going to walk through it really quickly. There's Tazwell Thompson, and he was an actor as well as a director, directed a lot of operas. This was his first libretto. Janine Tesori is an Italian-American composer who's probably best known up until this moment, though that's changing, for musical theater, Caroline or Change, Fun Home, many other great things, Shrek the musical, Shrek 2 the musical. She's in that group of women, her with Missy Mazzoli, where the Met commissioned them to write an opera. Hers is Grounded, is the opera. It was premiered at Washington National Opera and sort of as a tryout, and will go to the Met soon. Okay, the opera starts with, in the middle is the father, and the characters are called father, mother, son. There are 3 girlfriends and 3 police buddies. So it almost has, and Tazwell's talked about this as a theater scholar, sort of classic, almost Roman style Greek-Roman play. It's set in the present in Harlem. And when we first see, and this is the production, the pictures you'll see were directed by Tazwell. In the middle is Kenneth Kellogg, who at this point I think has sung every performance of the father. I've gotten to see this at Detroit Opera, Toledo Opera, and Seattle Opera. And in the beginning, he walks into, and Tazwell's directed all of them except the Detroit Opera, where Kanetsa Shaw had a different interpretation. We can talk about that. She has gone on to direct Omar. I've chosen these 3 operas because I know them pretty well, and I've known the creative stories behind them. So if you've got questions, I can sort of talk you through them, and we can talk later. Kenneth Kellogg comes out in a hoodie. And on stage, he then changes into his police uniform. The man in the back is very light-skinned, but it's an all-black cast. And so in the beginning, when you see, there's another policeman on stage, but when you see Kenneth Kellogg in a hoodie and the 2 policemen in the background, you're wondering, whoa, what's going on? But then you see that he is a new rookie police officer. The next scene, you are introduced to the mother, which is Breonna Taylor, the second from the right with the long braids. She's pregnant. She calls her girlfriends up and she says, hey, I've got a lot of news. You got to come. And they find out she's pregnant, that she's gotten married, that she's pregnant. She's an entrepreneur, has a Harlem eatery. When they find out she's carrying a boy, they're like, what? You're bringing a black boy into this world? And so you get sort of a beginning inkling into sort of this Black community's view of, the horror and the difficulties it is for young Black men. We then have the birth, and there's a beautiful lullaby that the father sings, and you have a nurse, one of the girlfriends plays the nurse, a high coloratura, and it's really funny because it's clear he has no idea how to handle a baby or what to do, and she says, okay, do you want to hold your new son? And he's like, oh, I don't want to drop him. And she says, put your hands, put your arms out, and he goes like this, and so gradually he brings them closer. He sings a beautiful lullaby, of which you don't get that many lullabies. I don't know of any in opera where men sing to the baby. In Hamilton, we have that nice Dear Theodosia, that both Burr and Hamilton sing. Okay, this is still the first act. It's 2 acts. By the end of the first act, the little baby boy has grown up to be 16. He's an artist, and the father and the son are fighting. The son is horrified that his father is a cop, and his father keeps singing "Officer of the Law." And they're just at the point, the boy talks about, he's been arrested because he jumped a turnstile, and when the father tells him, the boy says, it's this much money, this is against the poor. I mean, he just goes into this wonderful quasi-Marxist response. And they're getting, fighting, and just at the point when the father is like, okay, bring it, the boy runs to the father, and the father hugs him. And so it's gonna be okay. They can handle it, I have a 15-year-old at home. And teens will push you. Okay, there's another parent. Okay, in between the acts, something awful happens. And we find out when the father goes to see the Reverend, this is Gordon Hawkins, and you find out that the boy was shot by a white police officer. And the second act, whereas the first act is all about joy and expecting a new child, the second act is the horror. This is the 3 girlfriends as they were all around the mother in the beginning. Now they're helping her get dressed for the funeral. There they are at the funeral. There's an incredible it feels like an already made gospel tune, but it was a tune Janine wrote. There's the father and the mother, and then at the very end, at the very end, you see the father and the mother in their funeral clothes. They go for the epilogue where there's a table. The boy comes out, and that's when you find out what happens. The father and the boy, the mother, some of her wonderful food. They talk about cornbread and collard greens and butter beans and yams and all this wonderful litany of great black food. They say grace, and the boy says, hey, I just got into RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, as an artist. I'm going to one more protest. It's going to be a peaceful protest, Dad. Nothing will happen. You should come. And then the lights go out. Okay, this is Omar, which has anyone, okay, a few people have seen it, great. When you have the opportunity to see these operas, everybody in this room, run, see them, because they're saying something. You don't have to like them, but you gotta know about them. Sorry, that's just me. The teacher pops out. So this is Rhiannon Giddens, and was asked, it's co-commissioned by Spoleto in South Carolina and Carolina Performing Arts in North Carolina, because Omar Ibn Said was taken and was enslaved, first brought to Charleston and then escaped to Fayetteville, North Carolina, so the 2 states did the co-commission. Michael Abels was brought in to help with the orchestration. You probably know Rhiannon Giddens. She is, or you've heard of her. She is from Greensboro, North Carolina. She's won a MacArthur. She's done a lot with folk music. Has also moved into, this was her first opera. Michael Abels is a composer best known before Omar for Get Out and Us, working with Jordan Peele, thank you. I've got this all written down, but it's just for matters of time to go through it. Okay, and they worked on this. This is the portrait we have. If you haven't heard of Omar Ibn Said, this tells you a little bit about him. He's from sort of the Senegambian region, West Africa, was brought over, and one way he became very well known was that he was very educated and wrote fluently in Arabic. They used the idea of his writing. In fact, when he escaped from a pretty vicious slave owner in Charleston to Fayetteville, his whole cell was covered with his writing, and so the writing is a big issue. This is my own picture, where on the left is the picture they had for the beginning of the opera, and then with the writing on his face, that was at the interval, at the intermission, the curtain that came down. Here, the textiles, this is Kanetsa Shaw's production, and you can see sort of iconic images of slave ships that was on the clothing. Also, so you have that as well as some of the writing, both English and in Arabic. This is the prison scene where he wrote sort of all these words on the prison cells. There's elements in here where you get a lot of joy, even, and joy not like, woohoo, we're happy slaves. No, but showing part of the life that Rhiannon Giddens, I was able to speak with her a few times, was really interested in bringing in frolics and dances. There's a call dance. The person in blue is sort of a Sierra Leone Vai deity that spins around, and they're not really a trickster figure, but there's elements of sort of an African diaspora element here in the frolic with them. Yes, here you can just see more of the writing. There's an element too, whereas the father in blue comes out in a hoodie and then changes into the police officer outfit. Omar comes out as irregular clothes and changes in front of that first curtain, changes into some of these beautiful costumes. And then this element of we are sort of an element of claiming the story, and the chorus sings it. The productions I've seen, and for those of you who saw it, I don't know, at the end, the chorus came out in the audience, and yeah, it sounds like that. Yep, the two people I know are nodding their head. So there's an element that this is us too. Not that we are all Omar, but this story is part of our history. Okay, then the last work I'll talk about is the Factotum. This was a work by Will Liverman, who's in the middle, and Rocket Jackson, also known as DJ King Rico. He's the profile. And then, Rahenda Ramun Maharaj. I didn't get to know him as well. For this opera, I wrote the notes for the Chicago premiere, and I also wrote an article for Opera News when they used to be around. For Blue, I wrote the notes that are in the recording. And for Omar, I've written something up on the Southern Futures Carolina Performing Arts website. So again, I just want to let you know I've thought about these. If you're interested in reading a little bit about these, I can point you towards that. Since they're new, there's still more coming out. So Will Liverman, part of the Ryan program, which is the Young Artist program at Lyric Opera of Chicago, a high lyric baritone, having a great career. He would sing Barber, Figaro in Barber. He'd go around and he'd say, whenever you do a show, you got to get your hair done. Wouldn't it be cool to do a Barber of Seville in a black barber shop? And so he mentioned this to King Rico, and they set about this. This was in the 2016, 17, before the pandemic. And it was something they were working on when the pandemic came. Everything shut down, and they went to work because Will had that connection with the Lyric in Chicago, and everything got shut down. They did a wonderful, and on their website, I think it's still there, is a 17-minute documentary with interviews and a lot of information about them. I got to see an orchestral rehearsal September before, not this past September, but the September before. I didn't get to see the premiere because I got COVID, but they filmed it, did an archival, I got to see it, and that version might still be around. If anyone's interested in writing about these more, here's just pictures. It's not really based on Barber. Rossini's Barber was the inspiration. Here's some pictures. This is like Barber, which might have some misunderstandings, though this has more imbroglios, so to speak, where Will has inherited a barbershop from his father. His brother also runs the barbershop, but is a little shady. There's some issues that happen. There's Cece, their niece, who is sort of scolding the brother who's got a shady background, but it all works out. Oh, Children seem to be a feature in a lot of operas around Black topics, whether this was just a small side role, but as in Fire Shut Up in My Bones and Malcolm X, especially the revised version, young children, particularly young Black boys, seem to be an important voice. All right, here you can see the production. This is not at the Lyric. The Lyric sponsored it, but it was at the Millennial Theater, which is a smaller theater downtown, not too far from the Lyric. And if you look at the top left, that's where DJ King Rico, during the performance, was there doing some sort of scratching and adding little Rossinian phrases every now and then. The connection with they hired a local artist to do a mural, and this became the main sort of publicity. I cropped this picture so you could see that it really is in a parking lot and part of everything. Okay, I'm almost done. Okay, stepping back to view the big picture in Black opera, I'm noticing a narrative of themes and trends. Omar presents a great example of opera recovering and expanding historical stories and figures who we have heard of or have been minimized or forgotten. In the same vein, there are operas about Frederick Douglass by Dorothy Rudd Moore from 1985, I Dream about Martin Luther King Jr. by British Black composer Douglas Tappan from 2010, Harriet Tubman, When I Crossed That Line to Freedom, and Kiru Okoye from 2014, X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X by Anthony Davis, 1986, and then revised for the Met production, and Detroit, and Omaha, and Seattle Opera later this month. So that's one theme. There are operas about historical events. Amistad by Anthony Davis, 1997, and the Central Park Five, also by Davis, 2019. I've gotten to see almost all of these operas except the Dorothy Rudd Moore. That one hasn't been performed recently, but I got to see Amistad when it premiered at the Lyric Opera of Chicago in 97, and then Central Park Five. I saw a couple of performances from its Long Beach opera premiere in 2019. And happily, Central Park Five won the Pulitzer in Music. It was the first out of two operas, Black operas. Rhiannon Giddens Omar was the second. There is even an opera about the founding of an artistic organization, George Lewis's Afterward from 2015, that documents the power of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians and the event of its generative presence. I've only seen an archival, and when I say archival recording, that's a video that was made of the first performance. I wasn't there, so it's usually not super fancy, doesn't have super titles, but at least you can sort of sit through it. And it is quite an event to see this. There are themes that emerge with violence, policing, and bias. Blue, along with DWB, Driving While Black, 2018 by Susan Kandar and Roberta Gumbel. There are operas that question Afro-Atlantic religious practices. Scott Joplin's Treemonisha from 1910, Harry Lawrence Freeman's Voodoo, 1928, William Grant Still's Minette Fontaine from the 1950s. That one was never performed in his life. Closely related is The Power of the Drum in Shirley Graham Du Bois's Tom Tom from 1932, Still's Blue Steel, his first opera, 1934, and Troubled Island about Haiti, the first opera by Black composer, premiered at a major opera house, 1949, at New York City Opera. Themes around Black manhood, male sexuality, and sexual expression are candidly and carefully treated in Terence Blanchard's two operas, Champion, 2013, about the life of boxer Emil Griffith, and Fire Shut Up in My Bones, 2019, about New York Times writer Charles Blow. I wrote the program essay for the Lyric Opera production, Lyric Opera of Chicago production of Champion that's opened last weekend, is still going on, and that runs through February 11th. And then I wrote the essay for the Met's first performance of Fire in 2021, which also is used as the liner notes for the DVD recording. Perhaps most importantly in these themes is that all of these operas contain portions and broad sections where the characters on stage reflect some of the energy and warmth of real communities. Like every group of people, Black folks have love, tenderness, compassion, and joy in life. Each of these operas reveals this joy from the first act of Blue with the expectation of a new child, the friendship and dance we see in Omar, and the nexus of the barbershop to provide a forgiving space as well as for joking, working, and learning difficult life lessons. These themes are just a small sampling of the topics and directions I'm noticing. Embedded within opera is the ability to intertwine reality with history, artifice, and fiction. What brings opera into the realm of the real goes beyond historical accuracy, though that is part of it too. What makes opera feel real is the way we experience emotions while seeing it. Opera helps us feel things about topics, issues, situations, and characters that we might not have encountered or thought about before. These feelings and our thoughts about these issues shape our thinking and how we develop our beliefs. I'm not claiming that opera can change us. Instead, my belief is that opera can help shape our thinking as we try to move from difficulties in the past, the hard history of oppression, forward into the present. Art has the power of moving people's emotions, and this helps shape new behaviors and actions. The Opera House is being transformed from a place that focused on entertainment and spectacle to a space that can also ameliorate harm by acknowledging the hurt with sensitivity and care. Such actions can play a leading role in moving towards healing, redemptive repair that reflects a more accurate richness in this amazing tapestry we call opera today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this. This was very moving and important. I imagine, are tired, but I want to take a few minutes for questions or comments. Sarah?
First of all, I want to say thank you so much. Your harm care repair model is beautiful. And this is something in the abstract that I've been thinking about as an upcoming scholar and teacher. And thinking a lot about what role musicology has in that, or as a scholar, how can we advocate for our students, for groups that are marginalized. And you beautifully show how these works are doing that, a lot of that work, and of course sharing these works with students is important. I guess, what is your idea about the role of the musicologist in this?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for not saying, oh my gosh, that is so simplistic and crazy. How can you think of this? It's still new enough that I'm like, I believe these things. I'm hoping it works, so thank you. And also, I appreciate, and if anybody does have issues and stuff, please bring them up here or afterwards. I'm here through tomorrow, because I'm trying to figure out sort of how I sit in the opera house, and I've been doing this since the mid-'80s, where I'm, before opera got buff and fab, before opera had subtitles, and yet the power of what opera does, even with the canon, is important to me. And then to see these operas come out, I'm like, wow, this isn't just sort of a side extra thing. As an opera scholar, I see these hooking in. What can a musicologist do? I'd had a little experience without going into it now, though I'm happy to talk about it later. For 20 years, I was out of a music department, and I was in women's and gender studies and African American studies. Hence, a lot of the work I do on the African continent and all was because I had that opportunity. And I had colleagues who were eradicating syphilis in Nigeria, and working on reproductive freedoms in Sudan during revolutions. And my role, I was like, opera. And so part of this came out of, what are themes in the humanities as well, looking at artesian Chinese oil wells in Nigeria. I mean, these were things that my colleagues, I was reading their work and they were reading mine. And so as a musicologist, it was sort of, what do I do? And not just a musicologist, I do opera, which is considered some of the most, as we all know, some of the most arcane, most disembodied, and I thought there's a lot of powerful stuff that happens in the opera house. And so as a musicology, in Black opera, I talk about an engaged musicology, which is meant to sort of be an augment to public musicology. As public musicology initially was being discussed, and again, this is when I'm outside of a music department, I was reading about it, it seemed that it was, here are the right ways to sing trills, here, sort of a top-down model of, saying it in the worst way, though nobody in this room ever meant it this way, but here, great unwashed, here is how you do music correctly. And I thought, oh, okay, I'm among the great unwashed, so to speak. I'm not in the hallowed halls. I've been rejected by the hallowed halls. And so, but I still love opera, it still speaks to me. And what am I noticing? When people look at me sideways, when people have to explain what opera is to me when I'm in the opera house, because of course, what would somebody like me know what opera is? I'm like, I teach this stuff. So it's, what can we as musicologists do? I think one of the biggest things that has helped, I was teaching non-majors for 2 decades, show your enthusiasm. Show that you know this stuff, show the incredibly rich history, that these are gems for everyone, not just, a few privileged few. I mean, unless you believe that, do what you believe, but I feel this is music that makes us all better.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I wanted to, so I'm sort of thinking back to Pamela's paper, of course, and
Yes.
it's kind of perhaps a fixation of mine, the idea of going back to cultural policy and politics of culture. And there seems to be in your message a very strong idea of not just musicology, but a pedagogy of reparation that uses this aesthetic connection, right, as the medium. The issue is that you also are someone who works with opera companies. Do you know what I mean? You also have a voice there. And to be able to push that forward. Because in many ways, I mean, if we look a small experience of, I live in Boston, so Boston Lyric Opera and the Met. And many of the recent changes always have that little aftertaste of guilt and disingenuousness, right? The branding of an institution in order to be and kind of move over, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I wonder, do you know what I mean, if there is a way, I love your narrative, I don't think it needs to be complicated. You're saying, is it too simple? It's not, it is that simple. And yet I wonder if within there is also a very complex idea of what one can do as in interacting actively, let's say, with institutions.
Sure. I was shocked when opera companies kept coming to me and asked for sort of to moderate panels. This started happening sort of around 2015 was an important moment. The Blackness in Opera collection that I edited came out in 2012. And there was sort of nothing really like it. But 2015 was when the Metropolitan Opera was doing an Otello with Antonienko, and there was like the bronzer thing on the cover. And all of a sudden, the rest of the world sort of realized what we were watching, that opera was using blackface and yellowface. And when I brought it up to my friends, they would say to me, "Oh, Naomi, you are so sensitive. Come on, it's not real, it doesn't mean anything." And I said, well, it doesn't happen on the spoken theater stage, in musicals, in TV, in film. Even most high schools don't do this anymore. I think we need to pay attention to this, but I was completely sort of, yeah, that's not a good thing, but nobody really notices. So I thought, well, okay, I'm now going to say something about this. So that was part of the impetus for, instead of stopping with Blackness in opera, but to write Black opera and sort of take it further. My goal is not just to say, oh, look, there are these operas by Black composers, but that's why I try so hard to weave it into, this is actually where opera is going. We have colleagues who are happy to sort of end opera with the grand tradition. And for me, that says, well, kind of like Barthes with, the death of the author. Well, this is the birth of the reader, and let me be a reader for what some new things are happening. Sorry, I'm speaking on a couple of different levels here that probably folks who've been in the opera studies for a while have a better sense. But, and I know you probably, yes. So what do? I think we listen. I think we take sort of what's happening with opera now more seriously. I know Seattle Opera, a lot of opera companies were beginning to get it from their funding sources. What are you doing to reach out to the community? They're like, oh. So that was a good impetus. I think for us as opera scholars, what we know and what we love is so important. And again, it's like keeping Shakespeare from people or keeping museums from people. Opera shouldn't be kept from people, and we can help make it more understandable. And when people want to add their own stories, I mean, that was the thing when I was looking at opera in South Africa and seeing how this Ukarm and Khayelitsha, which Khayelitsha's a township outside of Cape Town, how they had translated the opera into Xhosa, not good with the clicks, and had all South Africans from this, mainly from that one township. And I was thinking, wow, is this sort of a weird anomaly or is this a thing? And then that's where I learned that opera was being sung in choirs, arias were being put into 4 parts. It wasn't just, here's the aria. We began to see Priti Yenda, Musa Nkonkano, Priti Yenda, other Pumela Machikila, big deal opera singers who grew up during the struggle had these incredible voices. And it's not, oh, South Africa just has incredible voices. It's, well, a variety of that culture sings. What can we do? We can listen. We can take it seriously. We can, yeah, or that's what I think. Thanks.
Allow me to. Oh, I didn't see you.
Thank you. This is kind of on topic with some of the other speakers, but relates to just the awareness. Do you think technology has made the listener more aware of what they're being offered?
Well, I remember going to the opera in the mid-'80s, and I was in college at Barnard in New York. Janine Tesori is also a Barnard alum, but she's a tad older than I am. But I would go because I could stand for $5. It was cheaper than a movie at that time. But there were no super titles, and it was still in the era before everyone had to be like svelte and hunky. It was sort of you just sort of sang there, and it was almost like going to the Mass in Latin, in that it was a mystical experience. Unless you knew the libretto really well, you didn't know what was going on. Then in '96, when the Met introduced seat titles, and they do it in an incredibly elegant way, where they're like 5 different languages, you can turn them off if you don't want, and you can sort of, how tall you are, because the proscenium, you just can't see, they can't do, it's too big. It seats almost like 3,700 people in there, almost 4,000. So that, I think, has helped a lot. I think for opera, people want to have an experience of going out, but they also want to, so people love to dress up for the opera. I don't think that it's too formal a space, but to make it something where people feel like they can go to. There's some things online where some Black women have said, oh, all these, white ladies are giving me so many compliments on how I look, which kind of shows the discomfort both sides are feeling. So I'm not saying this all that eloquently, but technology for super titles and seat titles is a wonderful thing. Reaching out to more people, having sort of community conversations, engaging folks, that's a great thing. Advertising or having information, not just on a few rarefied online sites, but more generally. And also, finding out who the community is and invite them to the whole season. Don't just invite Black folks to Porgy. That's really annoying. I've got other issues or other topic ideas about Porgy. Choose different churches, different community centers, and say, we're going to invite you to the whole season, and we want you to bring some people, too. Sort of really, I think technology is important, but also sort of the human connection is important.
I saw Max Jefferson's hand a fragment of a second before Manuel. Then.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
So this is a question that's building on a lot of what's been said so far or asked so far. But also I've been seeing or hearing a trend throughout the day dealing with the contention between accessibility and tradition, both of which are extremely loaded words, but we could take those in any way for the purpose of this question. And then we have circling the idea of what is opera, the audience, the creative, particularly the composer, and the executive. And in the work that we do in this room, and as we consider decentering or transparency, or what our goal is going to be, I was wondering, of those three, audience, creative, and executive, whose lead you instinctually would like to follow in the question of what is opera?
Audience, on stage, behind stage, is that another? Sorry.
Audience, composer, executive.
Okay. Well, I think we all should be involved with all of those. I don't want to choose. I'm in the audience. I'm on the board of the Detroit Opera. I write about, as I said, I've worked with lots of opera companies and more than just one-time things. I've been embedded. I'm finishing up my 5th season as scholar in residence at Seattle Opera. And I mention these things not to be like, woohoo, look at me, but I don't have a social media presence because it's too complicated for me. So the technology question, yay. If you can do it, yay. That's not sort of my world. We should be going to the opera, seeing what we can do. Opera companies are trying hard. Some of the smaller companies that have to be more nimble are having advisory committees in their communities. So you have the board who are because opera is expensive, we all know that. You need people who can pay a lot of money, but you also want people to come and to buy the tickets that are less expensive. In terms of, one thing I really appreciate about Christina Scheppelman is that whenever I go to Seattle Opera, she always makes time to talk to me. She's German. It turns out she's actually leaving Seattle Opera, I think, to go to Brussels. The opera community changes. I'm looking at my friend, Dr. Mohammed, who works and performs as well as directs with opera companies. There's not really however, if and I know we move around a lot as academics, but to get connected with a company where you are, see, I don't know how you can, if you want, help or to be involved. Opera companies, I live life through opera, which is sort of a weird thing to say, and I'm still working that out, but a friend said to me, you really think of opera in life, how I know a lot of, and so to take it seriously, I'm just rambling, that sounds weird, but I'm willing to talk about this more. Thanks.
Thank you. Very briefly, absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much. I also sympathize with the teaching on majors, which is what I do all the time, and the challenges that brings. But my question is a very simple one, precisely about audiences. Yeah. Have these opera companies sort of done anything to find out what audience think after the performance, after having come or after having engaged? Because audience remains perhaps the most difficult thing to study in a sense. And I wonder whether any follow-up, so to speak, research has been done because that's challenging. What do you do? Do you interviews? It's complicated, but and I think it'd be fascinating to find out what the reactions would be. So have any of the companies you have worked with done any of this? Thank you.
So you're absolutely right. It's hard to follow up, especially after a long night at the opera. So sometimes you'll have a pre-concert talk, a pre-performance talk, and there'll be sort of questions and surveys, but that's usually more about demographics and their connections. Some companies have, like Washington National Opera, Francesca Zambello is in working with North Carolina Opera. There are two, well, actually maybe even more, but North Carolina Opera's in Raleigh, and they're doing her Barber this weekend. Sadly, I'm not there, but I got to speak with her last Sunday and Wednesday, and she, oh dear, I say all this, and then she was saying that they do pre-performance talks. She frequently does them, and they get like hundreds of people who show up. Now, and so that's a way. I think, though, to get the kind of information you want, and it's a good thing to ask, would be for the company to have these advisory boards. Toledo Opera was doing that for a while, where they had their sort of the wealthy board, and then community leaders. And they had a really dynamic education engagement person who came from museum studies, but was interested in operas. And Toledo was sort of an interesting story. But she was out finding who works. She organized a panel on Trovatore, where she was looking at, I can't remember the name of the organization, but it was basically for mothers who were economically challenged and who needed funding, sort of like reaching out because of the figure of Azucena as a complicated mother. And so she was pitting it around that, which I thought, oh my gosh. Traviata, definitely working out to, and a lot of companies have done this. Aria Code that Rhiannon Giddens runs talks with sex workers and sort of so it's different. You can't just do, here's a self-addressed envelope or, a website, please do a survey, because I think I have, Detroit Opera was sending me as not just as a board member, but as somebody who bought something online. They did do sort of follow-up. So I think, I don't know how much is gained from that and what type of questions, and if you'd need like internal review board approval. But great question, because the audience is that's what needs to sort of keep growing.
Well,
I'm going to be around, and I really appreciate your attention and just wildly wonderful engagement this late in the afternoon. If what I said seems really wonky, please let me know that too, because it's, I've been thinking about it for a while.
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi.
Thank you.
Well, this concludes our first day. I urge you to come back tomorrow at 9 when there will be work in progress by graduate students coming from UC Berkeley, UCLA, University of Indiana Bloomington, and local UC Davis. They will really appreciate your presence. So I hope to see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.